Goodbye, everybody. As he said, my name is James Avington Miller Jr., and I've been an educator for a long time, a researcher, you kind of name it. Public school was my thing. I went to public schools. I'm a product of public schools. And if I blow this up, it's because I went to public school. No. uh, I am. He mentioned the radio show. Let me tell you how I got to the radio show. I left education and as a professor, and I went doing a lot of things, and I was away from education for a long time. Oh, about 10 years ago, I started noticing that there were things happening in my neighborhood that I didn't understand. I would see hordes of children running down the street in uniforms, like shorts and what have you. I'm going, why are they running down the street when they have their own playfield? I couldn't get that. So one day I was driving and I saw these same kids running down the main boulevard, and I followed them. And they went to a building, a two-story building that was maybe even a storefront or something before, and I went, what the? And the next time I saw some kids going like the other way, and I followed them, and they went to maybe a bigger building, and I'm going, again, what the? I found out what it was that these kids belonged to a charter school. They didn't have their own playfield. They didn't have their own gymnasium. And so they were running down the street, and I was going, well, why? What is this thing happening? And so I started looking into it. And that's when I discovered that public education, that institution that I love so much and have given my entire life to, had undergone some changes. And I didn't know what was going on. And so as I started to look into what was happening, I found out that public education, some were saying that public education is under attack. Public education is being assaulted. Some say public education is being reformed. Attack, assault, reform. I'm going, what is this? So I continued to look. And as I started to research, remember I told you I'm a researcher, so I got that curiosity. I started saying, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening here? This is not an attack. This is not an assault. And it sure is not a reform. This is a war. And I start looking again, and no one was saying war. One person had said there was a war on public education back in the early 2000s, like 2001, 1999, and what have you. But there was nothing else about looking at what was going on as a war. So I happen to be a person who was born during a war, and I will say when I was born, it was between, well, I don't want to say really, it was during World War II, okay? And so growing up after the war, there was a lot of war movies and war stories. So I grew up loving watching war movies and then actually studying wars, the great generals, the great battles, and etc. In school, I had no interest in art, science, sorry folks, the humanities. And even in history, I was bored when they talked about the Renaissance and all these other things. But when they started talking about war, I was there. Oh, I was all over that. And I got my best grades during the periods when we studied war. So I had this like war perspective or maybe a war mentality. So when I started seeing what I was seeing in my research, I was convinced that it was a war. It was not an assault like people were saying. It was not an attack. And it certainly was not a reform. It was a flat-out war on publication, on public education. And this war that I talk about has an agenda, like all wars. It has an agenda. As it's an agenda, it was the destruction of public education. Now, you know, as I just said, I love public education. I'm a product of that. I was outraged that this, whatever was happening, was masquerading as a reform. And the public was buying it. Everywhere you would go, people would talk about education, public education sucks. Public education teachers suck. The public schools and the kids that go to the public schools, they suck. I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. Something has to be done here. Because as I was researching, I did not see anything that was coming out basically as a counter-narrative to what was happening. I didn't realize that the corporate media, and I think we all know when I say corporate media, that the media in this country and around the world are owned by large corporations. Maybe about 5 or 6 of them own most of the communications that exist around the world. Television, radio, you name it. And so the public was buying this argument that public schools is a tragedy, one that has to be dealt with, and the only way to deal with it is to declare war on it. Although they never declared war on it. It was like a stealth war. It was like a soft war, but it was a war just the same. And so as I got into it, I got more angry. I want to say some other words, people, but you guys don't know me and I don't want to turn you off, but I got really blank. And so I said, what can I do to protect, defend my public education? And I came up with the idea that I would write either a novel or a screenplay. Because when I left public education, one of the things that I did was try to study and become a master storyteller. And so I learned how to write screenplays, I learned how to write novels, and I had written some stuff. And I said, I will go after the guys, the people who are attacking public education via a screenplay. And I started on it, and it was going to be how teachers got together at one particular school and tried to save their school that was going to be closed because, as we were talking about earlier, the test scores were bad and everything was going to pot. So that was how I got started. And as I was writing the story, I realized that teachers, parents, communities, whole states, whole country, didn't really know that, one, there was, quote, a war on public education, and two, they didn't know the real reason, motivation behind this war, that there is an agenda, and that the war that I talk about on public education is not about public education. Let me say that again. The war on public education is not about public education. What the war is about is a group of very, very wealthy people, corporations, individual financiers, and philanthropic people who used to be philanthropic are now vulture capitalists, vulture philanthropists, have come together and decided that public education is worth $1.2 to $1.5 trillion in this country. Globally, $7 trillion. And they want it. Plain and simple. They want it. They don't care about education, but what they do say is, We want to reform education. We want to close the education achievement gap, and we want to bring about a better class of educated students for the future. That's not true. What they want is to destroy public education as it exists in order to be able to erect a privatized education. They want to make public education not a public institution for the public good, but a private institution for the private good. They want to produce students now and in the future who will be obedient, who will accept the corporate philosophy, and who will then serve the interest of those corporate people. I give them a name. I call it the corporate state financial power elite. And their real reason for doing what they're doing, I call it the Machiavellian agenda. And when I say Machiavellian, almost everyone starts thinking sinister, deceitful, evil, and you're right. That's why I called it the Machiavellian agenda. That the overall agenda is to destroy public education, to erect this privatized system that will produce little minions who will serve the purpose, the interest of public education now and in the future. And the future to these people is 1,000 years. I call this, they are the new Reich. You know from your history, Germany, Hitler talked about the Third Reich. Reich in Germany means empire. These people, the corporate, what I call the corporate elite, have in mind that they can have a new Reich. But education was not only in their way, especially if we have education where we teach students to be critical thinkers, to be critically aware, to critically understand. And those three elements lead to wanting to take critical action to bring about social change, bring about a better world that would not be in the mode that these people have as their vested interest. This is why I believe we have this war on public education. And this is why I started my radio show, is to try and tell the public that all the things that they've been hearing that's bad about public education, bad about teachers, bad about schools, bad about the communities, bad about the parents, and etc., is a myth. It's not a myth, it's a lie. And that it has a purpose, and that purpose is to serve that Machiavellian agenda so that they can get their hands on our money, the taxpayers, via whatever way they want or can do it. And I speak to that last part in terms of how they get it. The term, by any means necessary, that goes back to Machiavellian. People don't know that, but he used that. He said, those of us who want to get power and keep power, we must be able and willing to do it by any and every means possible. I add to that, by any and every means necessary and available. And they have been very creative in the ways in which they have gone about to destroy public education in order to achieve their Machiavellian agenda as an end result. Now, I will conclude by saying that my message, and I didn't give a title because I wanted to save it to last. I'm a storyteller. And my message is this, that resistance, we have among us and among people in this country a scattered, small resistance movement trying to grow and get started. It's not organized. It's not well financed. We have controversy within the little resistance group. But I want to say this. Resistance matters. Okay? And for those of us who are Star Trek fans, resistance is not futile. Okay? And lastly, I will argue that resistance in the face of war, in the face of tyranny, resistance is the highest form of democracy. So when you resist, you are being democratic. You are being, we the people, for the people, by the people, says no. With that, my time is up. Thank you.